1 second, folks. I just have to find Killian for a second. Hold on.
Bear with us for a moment. It looks like Killian's having a couple technical difficulties. We'll be right back.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yep, we can hear you loud and clear, Killian.
Okay, cool. I got stuck there for a second.
Well,
awesome.
Thank you, everybody, for being patient.
Thanks, everybody. So, yeah, let's jump right into it and get started. Thanks for waiting. I appreciate it. And thanks, for everyone, for taking some time out to join me this afternoon, or this morning, I guess, depending on where you're at. So what we'd like to talk about this morning is a concept that we've come up with, and we called it Insiders of the New Malware. What I'm going to talk about here is kind of some tips and tricks that we've talked about over time in terms of securing the environment. And even though Varonis is talking about it, the tips and tricks apply even if you're not using Varonis. Obviously, we'd love for you to interact with us, but this is good, solid advice regardless of what you folks decide. So let's take it away. So just to set the stage, talking about security incidents and what we've seen in the media, they all have a lot of things in common. So in most of the major breaches that we've seen, one of the big things is that the threats were already inside the perimeter. So the attackers have learned that the perimeter defenses, and over time, people have focused a lot of attention there. And it's really pretty good keeping people out. But we have to change the way we think about it. It's not really an us versus them scenario anymore. The attackers realize that it's a lot harder to jump over the fence to crash the party than it is just to steal somebody's invite. So what they've been doing is hijacking credentials or compromising people who are already inside the perimeter, so insiders. Or they're going rogue themselves. So people who are already trusted insiders, who are already kind of past the perimeter defenses, are going rogue. So Snowden is the perfect example. Trusted insider hired as a contractor by the NSA, allowed in, given credentials, but he wanted to do something malicious. So he took advantage of his privileged position to exploit that. Same with the Chelsea Manning WikiLeaks things. And I believe Booz Allen Hamilton just caught somebody else trying to do another Snowden-like misadventure. So the bad guys are getting smart. They're getting inside the organization in any way they can. So instead of attacking the defenses, they're just bypassing them. The other commonality among all of these breaches is that primarily unstructured data was lost or stolen. And by that I mean the Word docs, the spreadsheets, emails, images, video files. And there are so many examples of this. I mean, Sony Pictures was a fantastic example. I mean, it's terrible what happened, but it's kind of the epitome of exactly what these attackers are doing. They compromised all the different systems in that. They stole scripts. They stole video files of unreleased movies. They stole email from the executives that was incredibly embarrassing and cost Amy Pascal her job. OPM is another incredible example of this. The report was about 200 pages that came out a month or so ago. And basically, the attackers were able to have free reign inside the organization. They didn't do a whole lot really sophisticated inside there. They ran a number of scripts and some other kind of minor things to collect all of the data living on the servers into one place and exfiltrate it. And that's information, I mean, almost every detail about folks that were vetted. So contact information, all of their personal information, all the information of their people they filled out on the security forms, fingerprints, I mean, everything. They just kind of trolled the file shares, gathered together, and walked it out. And the other commonality is that traditional security approaches in all of these cases didn't work. The firewalls, things like that. It didn't stop it because the attackers realized that once they were past that perimeter, nobody was really paying attention to what they were doing. So without analyzing how people behave within an organization or within the perimeter, these attacks go unnoticed. And again, Target and Anthem are another great examples of these type of things. They had a lot of security, a lot of budget to protect this data. But the insiders were able to get around all of that by simply getting inside the organization. And that's kind of the point that I want to start out with. It's really, really easy to get inside. If you think about it, phishing is probably one of the most scarily effective ways to bypass security controls. Shoot somebody an email, and in the case of the Verizon report, we probably should update with the 2016 release now that it's out, but 23% of recipients open phishing emails, which is incredible. So that's a quarter of your company, for example, that if they received a phishing email, would click it, would open it. And then 11% of those would click on the attachments. So it's incredibly effective with very little effort on the part of the attacker to get inside. And once they've had people click through and compromise their credentials or compromise their machine, they've bypassed the perimeter defenses and most defenses there. The joke that I always use to show how effective this type of thing is obviously, Varonis, we are a software solution company, so we have sales folks. The most effective way, in the case of salespeople, for example, to get a click-through on one of these, to get a phishing email to steal credentials or compromise your machine, is to send a sales rep, a malicious PDF, for example, that says, hey, this is a purchase order for something. I don't know a sales rep that probably wouldn't click on it because that's directly tied to their business. And this is applicable to any number of different organizations, but it's incredibly effective. So with this kind of simple trick, the bad guys are able to get inside and bypass a lot of the defense that we have. And then think about rogue employees who abuse their access. This is kind of the Snowden type of example. Or this guy here on the picture is my friend Disgruntled Dan. These are the type of people who are, again, legitimate and trusted employees of an organization, people who have been working for the company, who have rights, and are trusted colleagues and friends. but they might be unhappy or disgruntled. Or, you know what, maybe the competitor down the street offered him more money. So typically what we see is that they're going to want to take the data with them when they go to the competitor. So if the sales company didn't take the book of business or any other type of service provider, they're going to take their customer list. That's all intellectual property. Or if it's manufacturing, design, or software company, they're going to take some of the assets that they created. And if they're really upset with the company, they feel like they've been mistreated, they might also destroy data before they leave. So, hey, this company's not treating me right, I'm going to wipe out what I worked on. They don't deserve to have it. Or even just cover their tracks. If they're leaving, they don't want anything bad to turn up if the new employer, whoever calls for a reference. So these are the two kind of biggest types of insiders that we see among others. And what we're typically finding here is prior to the last year or two, a lot of the security issues were often looked upon as, hey, that's a sysadmin problem, that's a security guy problem. But they're becoming CEO problems. With a lot of these massive breaches that we've seen over the last few years, executives are starting to be held accountable for this. They're starting to lose their jobs. So the CEOs and the boards are starting to ask for this information. So just for example, you know, if a board member or a leadership member left, and the CEO wants to know, hey, you know, what did Bob, the executive VP, have access to before he resigned? You know, what did he take with him? Did he take sensitive corporate communication, merger and acquisition information? Or, you know, another common question, especially organizations deal with restricted or confidential information. Do I have any sensitive, information, credit card, PII, whatever happens to be, widely accessible? Or I'm sure everybody's seen the news lately about CryptoLocker. I think everybody from my grandmother to the boards of every organization, probably throughout the world, have heard about CryptoLocker and are probably afraid of CryptoLocker. So when they come and say, hey, listen, are we protected against this? That's a really, really tough question to answer. So how do we deal with this? Now that I've talked about kind of a lot of the different scary things that we face as security professionals and IT professionals, let's talk about some good news here. We have some tips and tricks on how to deal with these type of insider threats. So before we actually get into it, what I want to do is I want to talk about the framework, or kind of the baseline, the information that we need to manage the threats that we're seeing inside the organization. So starting at the top left, we need to know the user and group information. So we need to know what employees, what contractors, what accounts are at play with inside an organization. And this helps us start to map out who we're dealing with and figure out roles and relationships within a company. So we know who the users are, and the groups give us some context around, hey, maybe how do these guys relate to other folks? So peer groups, for example. The next piece of information is we need to know about potential access. So for any of these users that we're dealing with are groups, or if we add somebody to a group, what does that mean downstream? So if we add them to this group XYZ, what could that individual get access to in terms of my data stores or my email exchange mailboxes or SharePoint or whatever it happens to be? So if we put them in there, what can they get at? And then what can they do with their access? Can they read data? Can they modify? Can they delete it or destroy data? So when we start to connect these two things together, it's very important to figure out, again, who could do what and what could they possibly do? And then we take it a little bit further with content information. So now we know who's at play, what they can potentially get at. We need to know what type of data is stored in what location. And this lets us start to build a risk profile. So where do I have sensitive data living in the environment, and who could potentially get at that data? That'll start to give us a way to calculate some risk. So if we have restricted or confidential information or business intelligence information, whatever happens to be intellectual property, that needs to be protected probably to a higher level than some public or semi-public information like the vacation schedule or the company holiday schedule. So being able to know what data lives where and align it with who could potentially get access to it and the users that fall into that helps us, again, prioritize some of the risks that we're dealing with and figure out what we need to address first versus later on. And then the last key component is access activity. This is completing the circle here. So now we know who's at play, what they can potentially get to, and what sort of information is stored there. Now we want to know what they're actually doing with it. And with that actual access activity, we can start to develop baselines or profiles about how people are using data and what it looks like. So if it's normal access, if it's anomalous access. And that leads us into our strategy, our three-step process: detect, prevent, sustain. So this is kind of broken down into high-level categories and sort of walk through each one. So the first one is detect. This is just turning the lights on. One of the hardest things to do is you really can't protect what you don't know and you don't understand, especially when it comes to data. So in the detect phase, we're going to want to figure out what's going on. Turn the lights on. Get some of those pieces of information I just talked about in the previous screen to start to see how the environment looks and start figuring out where I have threats and where I have risks I need to address. The next phase is taking action on what we found, so preventing attacks or disaster by locking down data, securing it to the right folks, and aligning access to those who need it to do their job. And then the last portion is sustain. So this is taking the prevent stage and putting it into a framework so it can be done repeatedly and automatically without having a lot of manual process to redo this. Once folks have put in the effort to secure data, they want to be able to maintain that state instead of having to do a cyclic process of major projects to ensure it's secure again. So maintaining a secure state throughout the rest of the life cycle of an organization. So in phase one, we're going to do basically what attackers do. We're going to want to map out the environment. So that's the first thing an attacker, advanced persistent threat state actor, or even a rogue employee does when they get inside the organization. They want to see with any one of their credentials what they could potentially access. So they're going to try and traverse the file system data, SharePoint, connect to as many mailboxes as they can in Exchange, and figure out, hey, based on this user account I'm operating under, if they're an outside attacker and they don't know, what folders could I get to? What's going to allow me in? And that's the first thing we as defenders need to do, is we need to figure out what they're going to go after. And we're going to do that by, again, doing the same thing, enumerating the directory structure and figuring out how the permissions are set at all of these different locations. The next thing that we're going to do is we're also going to enable auditing. So we're going to find out who's using what data. So for every user in the organization, it's important to understand what those folks are doing, what they're accessing, what they're not accessing, and then over time build baselines around it, so profiles of how they actually behave. So that, for example, if an employee typically accesses data in certain patterns, say their finance employee, maybe towards the end of the quarter they're more active preparing reports. We want to know when that behavior changes, for example. But it's important to collect this across all the different platforms, so we know how people are acting everywhere, and we can trace threats throughout multiple different platforms, because attackers very rarely only come in and target one piece of data or one system. Their goal is to get in to the organization and spread themselves wide and deep. So to get access to as much data as possible and then embed themselves into the system. And by tracking information across multiple different platforms and multiple different servers, that gives us a clear picture of what's happening. So taken in isolation, one single action or event might not look suspicious, but when it's combined with multiple different pieces of information from different platforms, a pattern starts to emerge. And this kind of just summarizes what I said. Analyzing behavior activity across multiple files and figuring out what doesn't look normal for a particular user. Or, for example, for a service account. Attackers also like to come in through service accounts, and those typically have elevated rights. The nice thing about service accounts is they're supposed to do one exact thing. And if they start doing anything else but that one task they're supposed to be doing, it's a pretty good sign that something's gone wrong. Another huge one, and I've talked about this before, is encryption of multiple files. Really, ransomware is the only inside attack that wants you to know it's there. It's the only one that's going to ring you up and say, hey, by the way, we've got your data. So being able to detect that, the pattern of how it's behaving, before it actually rings up and says, hey, listen, I've got your data, it helps tremendously in terms of reducing cost to restore the data. So aside from paying the ransom, you would also have to, for example, factor in downtime from the systems, lost productivity from employees. So the quicker you can find the detection cycle and arrest that behavior, overall it's going to cost less money. And the other trick that ransomware likes to also do is trying to destroy backups or wait out the life cycle of the data to force you into paying ransom. So the quicker you can discover it's out there, the better. And then the last one, just privilege escalation. This is, again, a key component to every attacker getting in. They want to get as much rights as possible to as many servers. So they're going to go after the privileged accounts, domain admins or executives, for example, or service accounts that have elevated rights, because it's going to allow them to spread out in the environment and get deeper into the environment, solidify their foothold. So seeing any of these telltale signs is critical. And the faster you can spot them, the faster you can arrest that behavior. So just to summarize the detect phase one more time, we need to map out the structure. We need to figure out how it's laid out, what's exposed where, and what's going on. And then the key to that is to discover sensitive data within the environment. And that helps us map and prioritize our plan of attack and what data we need to defend most fiercely versus what data maybe is not as much of a risk or is secure enough where it's not a big concern. And then we need to start to figure out what the behavior patterns look like. So audit all file system activity. And then what we can do is a couple different things. Identify the administrators, the service accounts, the executives, the key targets of attack from the bad guys, and figure out how everybody in the organization behaves. So baseline what normal looks like for an organization. And that way we can just spot suspicious behavior or anomalous behavior. So that helps us kind of find that needle in the haystack. Hey, this is the behavior pattern. This is what we need to focus on to detect when something's going wrong. And then, of course, all these pieces of information will help us prioritize where we have the most risk and give us that roadmap for our next phase, which is prevent. So once we've done that prioritization of the data, so combining what we know about the content, if it's sensitive, if it's restricted, if it's confidential, and who could potentially access it, what we want to do is, the next thing is take action on it. That's going to be our guide. So if we have data, for example, let's call it credit card information or PHI information, that's open to everyone in the organization. And when I say everyone, I mean an everyone security group. And for those folks who haven't had the pleasure or displeasure of running across an everyone group, basically it's built into every domain, every file server. It means anybody connected to the network, for the case of everyone, could potentially get access to data if that permission is applied to the file system. So it's a tremendous risk if it's present on any of the file systems within an organization. So it's critical to spot that and lock it down. And that brings me to the next point, is eliminate these guys. Almost no data within an organization should ever be open to a global group like everyone or authenticated users. Aside from, maybe the company vacation, days and some other general company policies, all data needs to be restricted to just the folks who have business need to know. So finding those groups is key, and then taking action on it, eliminating it, figuring out where they exist so we can remove that. And then aligning the right business users to that data. So one of the toughest things about eliminating global groups is making sure that you don't stop business. So being able to figure out where they exist and then getting the right people assigned to that data to secure to just people with business need to know. In the case of the example here, the legal share. That's, pretty clear cut. Hey, this is a legal share, probably contains sensitive data. We need to make sure it's restricted just to the folks who are on the legal team. And then another big portion of this is simplifying permissions in the group structure. Attackers thrive on chaos. They love what they call dirty networks. And over time, it happens to everybody as data grows, and it grows at a tremendous amount a year, about 50% year over year, more or less, actually even more recently. And the strategy for administrating this data changes over time based on different policies and who's actually running it. So with those changes, it results in a couple different things. Potentially, permissions are inconsistent or inconsistently applied down the directory tree. And the easiest way to get a single version of the truth, so for any data set, for example, the legal folder, we don't want to have to go to every single folder and right-click to look at the permission. So if we can apply a consistent set of permissions near the top of that tree with a logical group, for example, a single-purpose read group and a single-purpose modify group for that particular folder, it makes it very, very easy to review who has access. And then there's also the case of sharing permissions versus NTFS permissions. So over the years, Microsoft has changed the way that they conduct permissions. So sharing permissions are basically how it's presented out to the network versus NTFS permissions, which are on the file system. So to rectify this, Microsoft recommends best practices that sharing permissions are always set to everyone full. And you're probably going, hey, wait a minute, Killian just told me that the everyone group is terrible. It is terrible. But in this case, to figure out what the effective permissions are, you have to map the share permissions and the NTFS permissions together to figure out what the effective access is. So by setting the share permissions as everyone full, and then using the more granular NTFS permissions to restrict access, it means the effective permissions will always be the NTFS permissions. So there's no guesswork, for example, on what somebody truly has access to for any particular data set. So to sum that up again in the prevent phase, the first thing we want to do is, once we've figured it out, we want to lock down the sensitive data first. That's going to be the most pressing issue, because it's going to pose the most risk to an organization if somebody were to come and steal it or delete it or encrypt it in the case of ransomware. And we're going to do that by first eliminating global groups. Almost nobody in an organization should have access to any particular data set. So we want to restrict the use of those and get rid of them completely if absolutely possible. And by doing that, or when we're doing that, we want to simplify the permission structure. We want to make sure that the structure is set up logically and as simply as possible to avoid confusion and make it easy for security personnel and the defenders to be able to figure out who can potentially do what quickly and effectively. And then also review this. Part of that is to bring in folks with the right context. So figure out who owns any particular data set from the business side. So as IT and security folks, we're often stewards of a lot of data that we don't truly own because it lives on our systems or something that we're managing. But people on the business side of the house, they work with that data every single day. They understand what it is, and they have a pretty good idea of who should or shouldn't have access to that data. So bringing them into the conversation is key for really the next phase, which is sustain. So we'll figure out who those people are, and we'll get them engaged. We'll say, hey, listen, here's your data. Here's who can get access to it. And that allows us to sustain the process. Once we figure out who we need to talk to about any particular data set, we want to associate them with that data set. So we want to assign ownership. So we want to look at who can potentially access the data, for example, and figure out based on how they're accessing the data, and this is going back to the audit information if we're collecting it. It's often difficult to figure it out manually by right-clicking on files or folders, because we typically see that if the data has ever been moved around, for example, it's been reset, the file system owner has been reset to administrator, or the original document creator is oftentimes, whoever created the template, or maybe an employee that was at the organization 10 years ago and they've been recycling the same document template. So by using the auditing information, it really helps us get down to who could be the potential owner, about 1 degree of separation. So in this case here, we look at Alan, Margaret, Crystal, Andrew, and Ann. Alan's the top user of this particular data set in this example. So what we typically see is that the top user of the data is not typically the owner, but they know who the owner is. So I pick up the phone, call Alan, and say, hey, Alan, you're pretty busy on this folder. Can you tell me some details about it? And Alan will say, oh, yeah, it's our sales reporting folder. He's a data entry person. He goes, yeah, I just do the updated charts. But my boss is Crystal. She's the one who manages the whole sales team, so she's probably the owner. Again, call Crystal, confirm that, now we know with pretty minimal effort who we should talk to about any particular data set. And once we know that, once we assign them to it, we can start to automate the authorization process for any of this data. So typically, what most organizations do when granting access to somebody is that IT or security maybe is the hub for all of these different requests. So the end users will go to IT and say, hey, listen, I need access to this resource. And then IT has to either figure out who the right folks are and ask them, or just grant the access if that's the policy at the time. And it often leads to overexposed data or a really long turnaround time to grant users the access while IT is doing this. So by automating the process as much as possible and taking IT out of the loop, the business can operate at the speed of business as opposed to operating at the speed of IT, waiting for people to kind of sort out some of these details. And it helps the business become more productive and more efficient because they don't have to wait on slow IT processes to get them access to what they need. And on the other side of that, automating entitlement reviews. So folks are great at asking for access to different resources because our jobs are constantly changing. Our roles are constantly evolving. Our projects are constantly in flux depending on what we're doing any particular day. So everyone's pretty great about saying, hey, I need access to this resource to do my job today. But in a month, couple months, couple weeks, that requirement might change. The project might end. My responsibilities might have changed. And oftentimes we see folks retain their access over time. So by automating a process to get the right people, the data owners, to look at who has access to their data, it can help the IT and security organizations protect that data better by getting them involved to say, hey, listen, these folks no longer need this access. Let's go ahead and remove that to facilitate a least privilege model. And another step is to automate the disposition and quarantining of information. So a lot of organizations, in my experience, have a kind of let's keep it forever type of policy because somebody might need it at some point. But what that can do is it can put organizations into a bit of a bind. So if they're storing sensitive information for a period longer than is legally required, it could open them up to discovery in a legal situation. Or if they're storing sensitive information, again, for longer than it's active or necessary, let's think about, PII or PHI information. A Social Security number doesn't have an expiration date like a credit card. Now, if it's being stored because of some legacy process, maybe what could happen is it's posing entirely too much risk based on the value if nobody's using it, especially if it's stale. So being able to find that and either dispose of it or quarantine it automatically helps keep organizations protected and reduce the risk overall based on the data that they're storing and managing. So just to summarize once again, the sustain portion of it, it's really key to continuously monitor all the activity and file system information on an ongoing basis to avoid the process of fluctuation in security policy over time. And then, of course, part of that is to automatically catch and correct deviations from the set and trusted policy within an organization. And we want to do that through a couple different methods. So automating the quarantining of sensitive data if it's created or discovered in an inappropriate or unprotected location to reduce risk. And then, of course, to automate or dispose of the archival or disposal of sensitive information or stale data. Get rid of the stuff that's not providing business value. It's a great savings for risk reduction, so cost avoidance in terms of a breach, and also capital savings, so saving the company money by not spending money buying new disk, for example, to store data that's not being active. And then, of course, automating the authorization and workflow and entitlement processes. So making sure that the business folks can get access to the data that they need when they need it in a timely fashion, but for only as long as they have a business need to access that data. And throughout this process, some of the key metrics that we found are critical for our customers and for folks that we've talked to track and to determine the success of any of these different projects can fall into this handful of metrics here. So, for example, tracking the number of folders with global access is key. So global groups, as I've said many times, is a source of tremendous risk to an organization. And a great way to show that risk is being reduced is to track the trajectory of the number of folders with global access. So as it's going down in time, there's also a correlation with risk reduction. And being able to show that trend downwards is great for executives and the board and auditors to see that, yes, we are making progress in securing this data. And along those same lines, sensitive folders and events on sensitive files are also key. So every organization, of course, is going to have data that's sensitive. So even if it's not regulated content, there's also, company information that they're going to have to store. So tracking the number of sensitive folders and who's accessing them or the events around them are also key over time to understand what the risk profile looks like on any of the data that they have to store, and making sure there's no odd deviations or spikes which could indicate an attempt on the data or a breach of the data. And just around the long-term performance portions of it, tracking the number of entitlement reviews performed, for example, is a great way to measure business engagement in the security process. Security has always been a little bit at odds with businesses because it's always seemed in the past as a detriment to productivity. But by getting the business community engaged in the process and baking it in and making it part of the security design as opposed to an add-on, really helps them understand that they're a key piece of the business as a whole. They're not just another kind of name in a file or a cog in the machine. They're a vital portion of the security of the business as a whole. And being able to track that they're engaged is a way to measure that level of engagement. So just to summarize one more time, the way we see customers achieve success in security, especially around unstructured data, is through this three-step approach. So first, detect. Turn the lights on. Figure out what's going on there. Figuring out who's using data, how does that activity look if it's normal, and then take an inventory of the type of data and how it's being provisioned. Then prevent disaster by locking down sensitive information, removing dangerous artifacts, and making sure that data is associated with the right business individuals. And then last is sustain that secure state. Automate as many of these tasks as possible and automate the authorization and entitlement processes to make sure that the correct folks are engaged in the process and are participating in the security of an organization. Of course, what I'll mention too is that it's always great to get an independent assessment of security. There are lots of organizations that can do it. Varonis also offers a free threat assessment that will speak to all the categories that I covered in here as well and provide you with a nifty report to show the different risk findings in the organization. Any questions from anybody in the audience?
Sorry about that, folks. Killian, there doesn't seem to be any questions in the chat box yet, but I'm going to let JoJo just take it away.
All right. Thank you, Killian, again. And thank you all for joining the call today. Please feel free to type any questions you may have into the chat box. And in the meantime, I just wanted to mention a few things before wrapping up today's webinar. iSECURE is hosting a cybersecurity and Star Wars event this December. So if you're in the Rochester or Buffalo, New York area, stay tuned for upcoming information and registration on our website in the next few weeks. Also, for those who need proof of attendance for CPE credits, please email us at the end of the week at events@isecurenet.net, and we will send you a certificate for all the webinars you attended during the week. If you have any inquiries regarding the topics discussed during the webinar week, please feel free to reach out to info@isecurenet.net, and we'll have the appropriate person follow up with you promptly. Last but not least, we'll be sending you a survey at the end of the webinar series to get your feedback on all the presentations shared this week. Your feedback is key in helping us improve future events. Thank you again for your time today, and I hope to have you all back this afternoon.